Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ana Luisa Maffini, and I am a postdoc researcher at Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil, and I'm also a collaborating professor here at the graduate program in Urban and Regional Planning. It's a real pleasure to open this session by introducing someone whose work many of us have learned from, collaborated with, or even relied on, often without even realizing it. Professor Martin Fleischmann is one of the leading voices in contemporary urban morphology and spatial data science, and his career bridges architecture, geography, and open source innovation in a truly unique way. Martin is a member of the Urban and Regional Laboratory at Charles University in Prague, and he leads the research team on urban structure. He's also a fellow at the Geographic Data Science Lab at the University of Liverpool, and previously worked with the Urban Design Studies Unit at the University of Strathclyde. He completed his PhD in architecture at Strathclyde, focusing on quantitative approaches to understanding urban form, after earlier degrees in urban design and in architecture and urbanism from the Czech University in Prague. His research sits at the intersection of urban morphology, spatial data science, remote sensing, and the computational methods, always with a clear ambition to bring the architectural richness of cities into dialogue with the large-scale geographic and data-driven analysis. Few scholars manage to bridge these worlds with such clarity and consistency. But Martin's impact goes far beyond academic publications. He is deeply committed to open science, and his contributions to the open source ecosystem have shaped the everyday practice of researchers around the world. He is the creator of MoPy, the Python toolkit for morphometric analysis, a core developer of GeoPandas since 2019, and part of the PySal development team since 2020. He also develops and maintains other tools such as Clustergram for visualizing cluster analysis and XVec for handling vector data cubes. And on top of that, he regularly helps others with the data as a freelancer, strengthening a culture of collaboration and openness in our field. Today, we have the chance to hear from a researcher who not only advances theory and methods, but also builds the tools that empower all of us to do a better science. Please join me in welcoming Professor Martin Fleischmann.
Just to talk about our work on street networks and simplification of street networks. I will try to deliver on that, but I'm also going to plug some other stuff to the talk. Because the reason why we were doing such work around simplification of street network had a different reason than having a simplified network on its own. So I believe that you can see my slides right now.
Yes.
And what I can also do is that I can send you the link to where these slides actually live, where I forget about this. You can open it on your laptops if you wish to do so, and follow what I'm doing in here. I have entitled my talk Urban Morphology at Scale, Tools, Methods, and Data. I'll try to intertwine all of these things into hopefully a coherent narrative. But as you heard from the introduction, and as you may know, if you are working with urban morphology, I'm one of the guys known to be pushing urban morphometrics, pushing these new approaches to studying urban form. So I will start with a bit of introduction to what is urban morphometrics, because we have been doing morphometrics. I myself have been doing since 2017-18. We've been publishing papers using the term, but only recently I realized that we have never bothered to formally define it. Formally say urban morphometrics is from here to here. We are using very vague description of quantitative approaches to urban morphology. Just correct, but not very specific. So I started thinking about it. I started to ponder the question, what is urban morphometrics? And I got an answer. And that will surprise you probably, because this is the answer. Urban morphometrics is not anything new. It's not anything we invented. It's not anything Sergio Porta invented or Jacob Dibble invented with the first papers talking about urban morphometrics in 2015, 16, 17. It's been around for quite a while. And you will see that in papers by M.R.G. Gonzan, one of the greatest minds behind the British School of Urban Morphology, you'll see that he already talks about morphometric analysis, which means analysis based on measurements. In his specific situation, it was very delimited. He was measuring lengths and widths of plots, trying to understand the typology of plots and their evolution. And he was doing that, on top of a printed map with a ruler and a notebook, measuring length, width, marking the numbers, and then trying to make sense out of that. Obviously, we are at slightly different situation right now. So we can go back to what is urban morphometrics today, because it's no longer just an analysis of length and width of a plot. And we have formalized this definition for today's era. We're saying that urban morphometrics is a study of urban form through the means of quantitative assessment of its constituent elements. And you can see the first part is essentially saying quantitative stuff in urban morphology. But I think that the core component of this is the last part of its constituent elements. Because you can look quantitatively at urban form, urban structure, morphology as a field, from various different aspects. And you don't have to necessarily interact with anything that we believe urban form is composed of. Anne Moudon, in her seminal paper in 1997, said that urban morphology has three fundamental elements. Those are buildings, those are plots, and those are streets. But you can look at the structure without interacting with any of those through the means, for example, of remote sensing, through the means of LiDAR scanning of environment, through the means of assessment of Google Street View, for example. None of it is, from our perspective, considered urban morphometrics. And we believe that it's going to help the field itself, that if we all agree on certain definitions of what the terms mean. If you want to put it in the context, urban morphometric is conceptually obviously similar to historical geographical approach in urban morphology. That's M.R.G. Gonzan, Jeremy Whitehand, and all the British school followed afterwards, Peter Largan, and all the other people. That's where it can theoretically comes from. That's where the first idea of morphometrics actually appeared. However, today it's methodologically embedded very much in spatial data science and in geography. And that's kind of the work I will be showing you in coming minutes and hopefully minutes. So where we are today, 1988, it was very simple, but the idea was there. In 2022, it's slightly more complicated, slightly more advanced. And we have reached a situation where something which hasn't been around, let's say, 10 years ago, currently is. There are multiple dimensions. First of it is availability of data. When I started doing my PhD in 2017, I had to be relatively cautious about selection of case studies because it wasn't always possible to get the data representing building footprints, for example, inequality and the completeness I needed for my work. That's no longer the case. Well, it is still the case, but not necessarily as much as it was before. A lot of governmental agencies are now releasing high quality open data. There are other non-governmental projects, most important OpenStreetMap, for example, which provides building data, street data, and other types of data. There are some large-scale data products of building footprints derived from satellite images, like Microsoft building footprints or Google building footprints, and projects like Overture Maps, which are trying to combine and conflate all of this into a massive global database. It has obviously its drawbacks, and we can talk about those later. But if I decide that I want to do analysis of any city, I'm typically working within European context, so I'm slightly biased. But then here, I typically get something to work with. It's not always ideal, but it's much, much better than it was before. We've also seen evolution of software we are using to process the data. And I'm not talking about the specialized software in here, like MonPy or other tools. I'm talking about the backbone stuff, GeoPandas type of ecosystem, where without actually doing anything as researchers, everything became much better, much faster, much more scalable. Which brings us to the era where we can get quite a lot of performance from the tools, which are very user-friendly and very easy to use. And we are no longer limited to processing a single city on a big cloud instance, because back when I was doing that, I couldn't do it on my laptop, even though it was way smaller than whatever we're doing right now. So it allows us to do much more. And other things which allows us to do much more are different tools for automatized pre-processing of these data, because not everything comes in the shape we want it to. I will be talking about one of those in the next section. All of this together pushes the limits of scalability of morphological analysis, and we are entering era of scalable urban morphometrics. By scalable, mean that we are no longer restricted in the extent we want to cover. We can essentially go as wild as we want to, given the certain level of access to data, access to infrastructure, and ability to process it all. However, there are some data pain points. And the first one I want to talk about is this one. There is a big issue with streets we need to talk about. And it is that the street may not be a street. You are a group of researchers working within configurational analysis. You know all of this probably better than I do. So I don't have to explain what it means, but I will show you an illustration. If you get the data, typically from OpenStreetMap or essentially any other source, it will look like the image on the left. It will have all the details you can dream of if you are a transport planner. You have all the roundabouts, all the slip roads, all the little carriageways, all the detailed layouts of intersections. If you're urban morphologist, you're annoyed by this, because this is not what you want. You want to have a line that represents street as a space between two intersections, because as a human, you perceive that one space, and at the intersection, you can make a turn. That's what you want to represent in the data. And to get there, you typically need to take the original data and simplify it. And the best way how to do that is to open your favorite GIS processing tool and redraw it by hand. Because if you don't do this and use the transportation focus network in morphological analysis, it has consequences. And here I'm using work of Alessandro Araldo and Giovanni Fusco, published last year, on multiple fabric assessment, the pedestrian point of view focused clustering analysis of urban structures in France. And in here, I zoom slightly in here, you can see that this is indeed a very detailed network of transportation origin. And what you can also see is that if you try to read the pattern, read the urban structure around the street, you find weirdness in here. You find that, for example, this intersection, you have even 4 different types meeting. Dual carriageways occasionally have different types on left side and the right side, even though there is no understanding of the fact that this is one and this is the other carriageway in the same street. They're both measuring everything on both sides. As it happens, because it's slightly differently shifted, that it falls into the different group. And it's something that you typically want to avoid, especially if your analysis heavily relies on graph-based analysis, on configurational analysis of the type level space syntax kind of things, because this is causing mess. So what to do about this? As I mentioned, a typical solution, especially if you have some undergrad students at hand, is manual simplification, and it looks like this. It's incredibly time-consuming. It's at the same time very boring and repetitive, and occasionally very challenging to figure out how does this intersection should look like if I simplify it to keep the topology intact. And it just takes ages, and it's not scalable at all. So we essentially need an algorithm to do this for us. And we are not the first ones who came to the conclusion that we need an algorithm. Other people came to the same conclusion and gave it a go and tried to figure this out. But none of it is good. Let's say good enough. There's some simplification opens OSMNX package goes, halfway. There's a new tool called ParaNX, which takes a very different approach, and as a result, it's not scalable at all. There's some tooling to preprocess and simplify network in the CitySeer package. Garrett Simmons from UCL wrote, but it doesn't have very convenient API, and we had to actually rebuild it from internal components to actually work with it. And again, it's relying heavily on tags with an OpenStreetMap. And you may not work with OpenStreetMap data, right? You're working in a municipal context, you have municipal data, you need to be able to work with those. They have a completely different system of tags and attributes. So you can't kind of lock yourself within the OpenStreetMap ecosystem, even though it's beautiful. You shouldn't lock yourself anywhere. So we came up with an idea, and that resulted in a paper published, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, or technically in January next year, but it's out there, in Computational Environment and Urban Systems, where I joined forces with amazing colleagues from Copenhagen and Oak Ridge in the US. And we developed adaptive continuity preserving simplification of street networks. So let me unpack what this means. I'm talking about continuity preserving, which sounds nice, but what the hell does it mean? If you look at this network, it's a very tiny portion. It's kind of across the river in here in Prague. You can apply analysis of continuity. We are using implementation by Pratyush Tripathi, published in 2020, and essentially identifies continuous strokes of individual geometrical line segments that form a logical street. So essentially, you go at the intersection and then you try to figure out, is there something that kind of goes straight from where I came from? If that goes straight, it's probably the same street. If there's nothing like that, I should probably stop here and let other streets to take over. So the graphics on the right shows the identified logical streets as continuous segments. And we wanted to make sure that when we do the simplification, we don't break this continuity. So if you have a complicated intersection and you just take a centroid and just squash everything together, you get like a spider type of joints at an intersection, which means that whatever was straight is no longer straight. And these continuous segments will completely remap. And if you're relying on continuity to understand the backbone of the city structure, that changes. We want to make sure that this is not going to happen. And we came up with a few steps to ensure that we have an algorithm that can do simplification to a reasonable degree while not breaking anything like this. And this is a conceptual diagram of the proposed algorithm. So you take the input street network, which has its own ideas on how stuff should be represented. It has a lot of transportation geometry. It also typically has some degree of nodes of degree 2, those which are in the middle of the streets, like those indicated in here. Again, from morphological perspective, I don't care. I can't do anything there, just walk forward. So the first thing we do is that we kind of clean this. We deduplicate geometries because sometimes we have duplications. We ensure that our stuff is properly noded. So it means that when one line ends at kind of an intersection with another line, that there is a node on both of them, ensuring that it's a properly encoded intersection. We remove these interstitial nodes, and we do very small degree of node consolidation, merging stuff which is very, very close together, talking about like 2 meters tolerance. And then we take this and we do something we call phase artifact detection. And that's step that requires a bit more explanation. Because I was trying to figure out how to simplify street networks for the first time in 2020. I failed back then, I have to admit, but I had an idea. I was looking at street network and I was like, okay, so if you look at all those polygons enclosed by different streets, some of them will be normal blocks, and some of them will not. Some of them will be these artifacts kind of enclosed within transportation purpose geometry, inside of a roundabout, inside of a dual carriageway. And I realized that, well, these things which we don't want are either very small and can have any shape, or are large, but if they are large, they're very narrow and very long. And I tried to plot these two components against each other. And this is what I got. So on the x-axis in here, you can see the area in square meters of all polygons enclosed by a street network. And from this diagram, which looks like this in its entirety, if we zoom just to the left corner, we can see the circle compactness, the measurement of shape compactness, as is similar to circle. It kind of suggests the name. And we see that there are kind of two strange large clusters. One, which represents, in most cases, normal urban box. That's indicated in yellow. And the other one, which is usually detached from this one, is capturing all these face artifacts. There are some false positives in there. It's not a perfect gap between typically, but it does a very, very good job. And this simple trick allows us to identify all and most of these locations where we need to do some form of a change. All those problematic parts of street network, all those issues. It coincidentally also identifies kind of the highway networks in cities. And this is taken from the paper where we published this face artifact detection in 2024. And I don't have labels for cities in here, but the first one in here is Wuhan in China, which has a very dense grid of large highways. So you can see that quite a big chunk of the actual network is identified as artifacts, while I believe this is going to be Aleppo. Now I may be wrong because I don't remember it anymore. It's slightly different. But we are able to identify all those places, and now we are facing a situation, okay, we know where it is wrong, but what do we do about that? And that's where the main contribution of the latest paper and the tool which comes with it comes, and that's the actual simplification procedure. So we start with artifact classification. We take all of those polygons, which are identified as artifacts, and we split them into three groups. Isolates, which are those polygons which exist on their own. There is no other face artifact polygon next to it, touching it. We have pairs, which means that you have two joined together. And then you have clusters, which means that there's many continuous artifacts joined together. And then we subdivided those further. If we talk about isolates, which is the most common class, we developed a typology of these, a generic typology based on number of nodes that are on the edges of the artifact. So you can see that the first row in here has always two nodes, but in different ways. We have 3 nodes, 4 nodes, 5 nodes, and sky is the limit, 8, 9 nodes. And then there are some weird letters in here, and that's where the continuity component comes in. The CES typology, which we have included in here, captures whether the edges forming the artifact are formed by a continuous street, which will always be the green one. So you see that this street comes from somewhere, goes through the edge of the artifact, and continues further on. The same happens here. It comes from somewhere, it makes the edge, and continues. It's continuous edge. And we want to make sure that this continuity is not altered in the simplification. Then we have E, which are edges which come from away, but end here. So this one ends here. There's no other streets coming from here. And there is S, which are edges which exist only within the artifact. This U loop is one case. Our roundabout is another one. And from this logic, we have a heuristic, essentially, of solutions. If you can drop an S to remove the artifact, do it. If you have 2 E's figure out a way how to find a middle ground in there. So this is, for example, a situation where we're dropping. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse actually, but the 3 CCS situation is
Yes, we can see.
Good. So it's where you can see that the only thing that needs to happen in here that we drop this line to get an intersection which represents the original situation in a context which is not altering the continuity in any way. In other case, like down here, we essentially need to replace this whole complication by an interpolation through. And this is not optimal situation because you end up with two nodes that's kind of close to each other. You can post-process it, but not ideal. Same situation happens in here. To ensure that these two continuous streets are not altered, we need to make sure that everything that comes from here and here is reconnected to this specific node. Otherwise, we are risking that the continuity is not preserved. And roundabouts are relatively simple solutions. You typically just take everything, find a centroid, join to the centroid, and have your new node. With clusters, the heuristics is not straightforward. So this is a cluster composed of 5 different polygons, 5 different phase artifacts. And what we essentially do with any of the clusters is that we replace the geometry forming the cluster with a skeleton of the area composed of the cluster, which typically works well with complex intersections like highway, multi-level intersections. It makes a mess. But we came to this with an idea that we are interested in areas and cities where we have buildings around, where the actual morphology happens, where something interesting is going on. And we want to make sure that those are clean, and the algorithm does very good job in those situations. And even some massive highway far away from city center is broken a bit, I don't care that much. But there's a lot of space for improvement. When we have pairs, we solve them together as a single isolate, or solve them together as a cluster, depending on the situation, or don't solve them at all if that line cutting one geometry in two is actually non-planar. If it's a bridge, we understand this is a bridge. We try not to break the non-planar intersections in there. All of these is packaged in a Python package called neatnet. So we kind of hope that other people will find it useful, and we are making sure that they can actually use it. And I mentioned in the beginning that some other people try to do this, so we obviously try to look into how neatnet stands against the state-of-the-art tools. And here's some comparison. Again, the same part of the network in Liège in Belgium. With OSMNX, which is probably the most used tool, but it does not deal with tool carriageway in any sensible way. And it deals with intersections like in here, but kind of snapping all into the centroid, which means potentially remapping the continuity. Here's the cities here by Gareth Simmons. It doesn't do an amazing job on networks where you don't have the information from OpenStreetMap. If you do have the information on OpenStreetMap, it's much, much better. And it's also quite fast. Paranex is having its own issues, but it typically deals with the tool carriageways. So if you combine this tool with OSMNX, you kind of get, hopefully, to a degree, what you wanted to have. And this is the manual simplification, and bottom right is the neatnet result, which very much resembles the manual simplified network in here. I welcome you all to play with the tool, and Anna already mentioned that she did. we can have a further discussion on what is actually broken in there and how to fix that and whether it is actually fixable. But we weren't doing the simplification for the sake of simplification. And I want to go through the presentation a bit right now to actually show you why I was so motivated to make this happen. Before that, I want to tell you that the street networks are not the only data pain points in morphometrics. Zooming back to morphometrics, remember where we were? Plots are quite often not available as open data. And if they are available as open data, typically coming from cadastre, they do not often represent morphology. They represent the legal information about the ownership, about zoning, about other stuff, bind it to a legal system. Morphology is linked to that, but not always one-to-one. Karl Kropf published an amazing paper a few years ago looking at this, looking at situation in Great Britain, France, and other places, and concluding essentially the same. It's not reliable to use cadastre as a morphological plot because it just does not represent the same thing. And even in situations where you get a reliable plot, you find yourself dealing with stuff like this. Where on the left side, you have the traditional perimeter block in Glasgow. On the right side, you have the modernist housing in the same city in Glasgow. And the plot on the left side, if you eliminate all the buildings, you can still read a lot about urban structure. If you eliminate buildings on the right side, you get the weirdness. So the structural role of a plot is no longer the same in the post-war development, so it's hard to work with plot as a consistent spatial unit with a consistent meaning. So we wanted to find a replacement, and we originally came up with the idea of morphological tessellation, which looks like this. It takes building footprints, it generates a kind of a Voronoi tessellation around those, and goes with that, saying, yeah, this is some form of analytical unit that you can use. It works on a similar scale as plot. Obviously, it doesn't have the same properties as plot would have. But for a lot of types of analysis, it's good enough. And we need some form of a spatial unit underneath the buildings to get a sensible analysis that is relatively holistic. It doesn't scale. It has issues. So we came with another solution and updated version called enclosed tessellation, which looks like this. It takes streets and other physical barriers to delineate something we call enclosures. You could also consider it as urban blocks within the inner cities. And we do tessellation inside of those. So it's much more organized. It doesn't have those issues of cells going widely into open space. And it's also much more scalable because you do this tessellation with an individual small enclosure with the individual blocks. So you can parallelize it and do massive areas without an issue. This, as well as many other things, are baked into the Python package MonPy, which I originally built for myself as a repository of functions I needed to do my PhD. Because I knew I will not remember what I was doing and I will be using it over and over again. It's a good idea to make it a package. And somehow other people liked it and are using it as well. I'm glad for that. And I'm sorry if you've been using it for a while and the API has been changing widely. But I made a lot of mistakes when I started doing this, and I tried to fix them over the years. So some stuff has changed. With MonPy, we can measure potentially hundreds of morphometric characters. And we originally tried to classify those into 6 classes, dimensions. Those would be some stuff like building area. Shapes, that's the circle compactness we have seen before, for example. Spatial distribution, that can capture stuff like shared walls ratio, a proportion of outer perimeter of a building that is shared with another building. Intensities, that's covered area ratio, and you can use tessellation as the underlying spatial area unit. Or you can talk about the number of intersections per 100 meters of street network. Anything you can think of. Then there's diversity, which is partially seen as a meta class because it looks at variance of certain morphological properties within space. And then you have connectivity, which is everything that has to do with graph properties of street networks, something you will probably be most familiar with from this set. And this all leads me to our current take on urban morphometrics. And the whole reason why I spent ages figuring out how to simplify street networks, how I spent ages with writing entire MonPy to be very, very scalable, why I spent a long time working on different components of the Python spatial data ecosystem, be it GeoPandas, be it libpycel, trying to ensure that I don't have any bottlenecks along the way to scale up urban morphometrics. So right now, we are exploring an idea of a morphotope. If you are familiar with my work, and if you are not, that's fine. But I should, explain that I've been kind of periodically coming back to an idea of urban classification, trying to identify morphologically consistent regions within city from morphometric perspective, from a data science perspective. And I came back to that again for the third time, and we're exploring it in a slightly different angle. So we're saying, okay, let's take all of this back down to the air, to the grounded in morphological theory. And in morphological theory, you find in the morphotope. Again, MRG Konzen, you will notice that I'm more influenced by the Konzenian school than any other. A morphotope is the smallest urban locality obtaining distinctive character among their neighbors based on their morphological properties. And we like this idea so much that we came with a question: how can we capture this? Because this is super fundamental for our data science approaches. If I can find morphotopes, I have building blocks of urban fabric. Building blocks which actually already represent a certain pattern of urban fabric. I don't have to do it kind of externally through some area around the building, in whichever way we define it. And we came with a method. The method relies on two input data sets, one representing building footprints as two-dimensional drawing without any further information. I have no idea how tall those buildings are. If I wanted to have that information, I would significantly restrict the applicability of the method. And we take street networks. Technically, we use the overture maps, but that's essentially pre-processed OpenStreetMap dataset. We generate a couple of other elements out of that. Nodes representing street intersections, those enclosures I was talking about, and then cost tessellation. And then we measure stuff. We do our morphometric analysis. We measure 54 or 58 different morphological variables. Some of those are linked to individual geometries, individual objects, individual layers. That would be, again, building area, building shape. Even the shot-loss ratio that still kind of uses individual layers. Others are using combination of those layers. Alignment of street and building is one example of that. We link all of it to buildings, because even if we measure stuff on street edges or street nodes, the building lies on one of those, or both, but always on one, primarily. And we ship it to the algorithm. The magic, that's where the magic happens. We have developed a magic called spatial adaptive agglomerative aggregation. It's a bit mouthful, but essentially it's regionalization algorithm that is able to identify contiguous regions of certain distinct properties among their neighbors, very closely following the definition of morphotype. And it's able to do that in a way which is very scalable and in a way which is very adaptive. So the degree of what is considered distinctive always depends on the specific location and the neighbors around each of the buildings. So we don't set, okay, distinctive is this number. No, we say whatever is distinctive in historical medieval urban fabric is in principle much more similar to each other than whatever is distinctive in modernist housing or industrial area. And we need to be able to adapt to this varying heterogeneity of urban fabric. So we apply this and we get morphotypes. Let's look like this. This is the center of Prague. And you can see that we have a lot of morphotypes in here. That was intention. Yes, if you again recall the definition, is the smallest urban locality obtaining distinctive character. I'm going to zoom in slightly. And you can see that, for example, this orange part is distinctive among its neighbors, right? It has slightly different shape. There's a hill down there. The internal courtyards are different than those in here, even though it's in the same hill. This is not in the hill. Again, it's slightly different. And you get all these nuances. This is very steep hill, for example. All these nuances we can then work with and further analyze in an attempt to understand the morphological composition of a city. And it allows us to do something we call a flexible definition of built-up fabric. And here comes another diagram, which is essentially the second part of an entire pipeline. We take morphotypes, and we aggregate morphological data on those from the buildings they're composed of. We measure a few additional ones, and we generate something which is called the linkage tree. It's essentially a hierarchical aggregation capturing the similarity. You take the two, which are the most similar, you join them together. You do it across, and then you always joining until you have only two branches and then only one. And then from the tree, we can cut it at 2 branches to get this 4 branches, 8 branches, 15 branches, 20 branches, 100 branches, 500 branches, depending on the use case. And we applied this on 6 different countries, originally in Central Europe: Germany, Austria, Czechia, Poland, Slovakia, and Lithuania, amassing something like, I believe, 90 million buildings, 90 million buildings, and got classification which looks like this. And this is a visualization which would be much better to look at it at a poster session at the conference than during a quick presentation. So let me walk you through individual components of what we actually see here. In the middle, you see the actual tree. This is what reflects the similarity between different types of morphotypes. Whatever joins deeper on the more outside is more similar than whatever joins later. So these green morphotypes will be more similar to these than to the yellow one, and all of these will be more similar among each other than to anything on the other side. Then the next 5 rings, which illustrate average values for 5 morphological properties. We have building frequency, which is number of buildings along the street. We have building area diversity, we have measuredness of street network, we have inter-building distance and building area itself. And we can see that, yeah, these types of morphotopes have relatively small areas. These are larger. These are the largest. At the same time, there's quite a lot of streets, a lot of buildings along a street in here, which is not necessarily the case in here, and so on and so on. You can try to build your intuition about what the different branches are about. Then you can have a look at the abundance, which is the number of buildings belonging, or number of morphotopes belonging to each of these branches. This is on a log scale, so there are much high differences that we see in here. But you can identify there are some outliers in here, in here, in here. But overall, it's relatively nicely balanced. And then you have 2 examples for each branch. So you can see that, for example, everything in here are different types of villages, essentially coming from the very linear ones to more compact and dense ones. This, which belongs to the other branch in here, would be the dense city centers, and then urban type of development, and various kinds of garden cities. And you can kind of spend ages looking at this. Or you can have a look at the tree and try cutting it. If we start in here, cut it into 2 branches, which is what we call a level 1, you get resolution like this. We try to name the branches, and we get incoherent and coherent fabric. Coherent is typically in the city centers, incoherent on the peripheries. Then you zoom in, you cut it slightly deeper, and you get 4 branches. And because those branches, have a parent branch, you can further identify incoherent large scale, incoherent small scale, and coherent interconnected and coherent dense fabric. It's typically the easiest to see on the small town in here on the left side, which coincidentally or not is my hometown. And if you go deeper, you can go to 8 branches, which would look like this, again with certain attempt to do a naming. And if you look at all of this, combine it into a single massive database, you get something we call urban taxonomy. And that's our the project where all this method is being fed into. And it's a project which has its own website, urbantaxonomy.org. On the website, there's a map. And this is the map of the classification I just showed you, which allows you exactly the same stuff I just showed illustration-wise. You can filter those different parts, have a look, what does it mean for the structurality, and then go deeper. Then I have to stop at the sorry, I'm not sharing. You don't see it?
We can't see this part.
You can't see this part. That's a shame because it's a beautiful part. Let me solve it. I'm gonna solve it in a way that I'm gonna.
Now we can see. Now we see.
I know that you do, but okay, but it's not gonna work in here. So I'm going to do a different way. I'm going to do it like this. And now if I go to full screen, can you see it? You can see it, right? Good, good. Thank you for stopping me in here. So this is the website I was talking about, urbantaxonomy.org. You have a map. You can put a map on a full screen. And then you can start looking into different parts of the taxonomy. You can start filtering by the branches, coherent, incoherent, going deeper, interconnected, or going deeper inside it, into the branches which are no longer named, but they mean something. This is the most historical, ancient part of Prague. And you can start looking at Prague, and you can start looking at other places, because this doesn't stop in here. It actually goes all the way to here. And I'm going to switch to dark mode because it's nicer, better visible. And this is the current coverage we have. Originally, we covered 6 countries. Now, since last week, we have 4 more. It's 170 million buildings. And you, for example, have a look Paris and do the same type of filtering in Paris to see what is actually making coherent Paris and what is making the incoherent one. I don't have Brazil. Thank you for the question. We can have a discussion afterwards about that. And we started to ask questions about this, obviously, because this is great. But yet again, even though I love this very much as a morphologist, and I can spend ages looking at the map itself wasn't the final goal. It only allows us to start asking questions we couldn't ask before. So let me go to the final part of the presentation, where I show you first attempts of trying to understand the relationship between urban structure and geography at large scale. In the preprint for the method and the classification, which you may have seen, this figure, where we try to, illustrate the relative presence of different types. You can already start seeing something interesting in there. The incoherent small-scale linear fabric, those villages along streets, typically in Poland, and not very much anywhere else. And you can start digging into this, but it's not enough. And right now we have this coverage, not only those countries. So we ask a question, can we identify some cultural, political, essentially any social differences in the way how cities are built or environmental, we don't know, in different regions? So we have looked at the tree and we cut it relatively deep at the level where we have 107 branches. And then we have overlaid a grid across entire part of Europe we have covered in our data with 50 kilometer by 50 kilometer cells. And we computed the proportion of each of these 107 branches within the grid. So we get data like this. For example, presence of a branch with ID 87, we see that it's quite a lot of it's here, some of it's here, some of it's in France. The branch 33 is a bit in southern France and quite a lot in Lithuania and very eastern and northern Poland. Branch 17 is nearly exclusively in southern Spain. And we have 107 of these maps and 107 of these variables. So again, it was like, okay, if I want to understand boundaries, that's quite a lot of data to work with. So let's compress it. And we compressed it into 2 dimensions using UMAP, which is nonlinear way of dimensional reduction, which gives us 2 dimensions, trying to compress all of this information into those 2 variables. They look like this, but this view is not the important one. You can already start seeing something in here. Notably, the boundaries between countries are starting to pop out. But important and most useful aspect of the UMAP embeddings, the data reduction, is if you plot it against each other. So on the diagram in here, the scatter plot, you see the UMAP component 0 and UMAP component 1, plots it against each other, and all the grid cells are, color coded to identify where they are on the map. And then here we can start looking at the diagram and these differences and the gaps, because the gaps in the diagram, in the scatter plot, represents boundaries in space. If those clusters are actually spatially contiguous, which you have no idea, because there is no information about spatial location itself anywhere in there. Anything we have in there is just the morphological composition of those grid cells. So let's start with the first one. Down here is Germany, which is split into 2 clusters. Why? Well, because one of them used to be a different country. It used to be Eastern Germany, and the other one used to be Western Germany. For a certain period of time, they were developing their cities differently, and it made them mark. Obvious thing, right? But what about this one? What about this gap in here in Polish data? Well, if you look at it, we see that again, this gap is spatially restricted area. It's following a very famous phantom border in Poland, which coincides with former Russian and Prussian, the kind of German-speaking part of Poland. If you see at the results of any elections in Poland, you will see this boundary. And if you look at the way how the cities in there are built, you will see it as well. And you can also notice that mixed in here, so outside are some border areas where everything is kind of fuzzy. The same happens with these 2 Czech cities, which are unsurprisingly, sensibly mixed with Polish cluster, because those are part of Silesia. It's a region which is 80% in Poland, 20% in Czechia. There are some fights who should have these parts. We won a small portion of it, but morphologically and culturally and historically, it's actually one region which should belong together. Here we see that there are some hidden grid cells belonging to Spain, but they are hidden away from the main Spanish cluster for a reason that this is Galicia and other northern regions in Spain, which are culturally distinct. They even use different language. They have different history and different ways of building their cities. Partially it could be due to this. Partially it could be because they have very different environment, different access to different type of sea, to the ocean, and all of these could play a role. We don't know yet. I'm not claiming what's causing the difference. I'm just saying, hey, there's something we see in the data, which is interesting. The most interesting one is Belgium, because every single other country is forming a consistent cluster on this diagram. Belgium is not. It's kind of spread all over the place. Well, if you know a bit of Belgium, you probably understand why. Belgium is split into 2 main regions. The northern part of Belgium is speaking Dutch. The southern part of Belgium is speaking French. There is also one small German-speaking region in the southeast. And if you look at different dots belonging to different places in the diagram, we see that this on the very, very south, which probably covers quite a significant portion of France, not just Belgium, is very deeply embedded in France. These 4, which are on the southern French-speaking part of the country, are still very much attached to the French cluster, while these, which are in the Dutch-speaking region, are very much linked to the Dutch cluster of urban structure. So if you look at Belgium, at this kind of mess of a development, You can see all these nuances and all these differences, which we hope that we will see. But I was honestly shocked how well we see it, for example, in Belgium. And this is one example of the type of questions this type of data will allow us to ask, and one type of approach that we can take in further scientific activities. So let me finish with some take-home points. Times have changed since MRG Konzen was measuring width and lengths of plots by hand. Methods of doing that have changed, but the concepts behind morphology and concepts we are using right now, those have only evolved in time. We have essentially not invented anything in here. We just made the ideas which were unable to materialize before, we just made them happen. I think I proved across entire talk that urban morphology can be very deeply embedded in spatial data science, and all the computational tooling and open source science and reproducible science. And morphometrics can support quantitative studies done at scale. We no longer limit it either to individual cities or regions or smaller countries, or on the other hand, limited to global data sets, but representing morphology as something like local climate zone, which, gets you only as far. And we also seen in the last part that structure of cities is deeply affected by culture, politics, environment, and we can see this in the data. And we can try to understand why is this there. We can try to kind of unpack all this, which we as architect, kind of feel, because you look around and you see, I'm probably in Italy or I'm in France. But you see it from the architectural perspective. The fact that it's deeply embedded in every other scale is, to me, it's super interesting and super fascinating. And with all of this, we can ask questions like never before. And that's the whole point why I'm trying to do all of these things, why I'm trying to release all the tools, MonPy, NeatNet, GPSCU, everything, why I'm trying to release all the data, because everything we have seen is available to download. I'm trying to enable other people to ask questions they only dreamed of asking, and give them tools and ways of actually finding the answers. That's me. Thank you for your patience and for invitation again.
Thank you.
So I think now it's time for questions.
Yes.